The week before this conference here in Rio, there was a preliminary conference organised by ICLEI, which is a group devoted to applying the principles of the 1992 Rio conference to local administrations and governments all around the world. And at that meeting, at which we had spies listening in, they were saying to each other, we can no longer talk about Agenda 21 in the context of the environment, because the environment, thanks to those wretched skeptics, has become a dirty word. It's no longer fashionable, it's no longer cool. We won't be able to win the argument if we talk about the environment anymore. We can't talk about climate change because even we have to admit it's not happening as they said. We can't talk about green issues because, frankly, in the West, the environment is largely quite well regulated altogether, and it's just been vastly overblown. They themselves were saying this. They were saying we cannot justify an environmental agenda, which is what Agenda 21 is supposed to be, in environmental terms. Now, this is an extraordinary admission. What they should have done, therefore, is to say we don't need Agenda 21. But, of course, they do need it. They need it just as the people here in Rio who are at this conference needed this environmental thing, because their real ambition has nothing whatever to do with the environment. I first learnt this when the late Eric Ellington, who was one of the founders of Greenpeace, who became quite a friend of mine and was a genuine environmentalist, nobody more non-political than he, told me that a couple of years after they had founded Greenpeace, they had all had to leave because they weren't politicians and they weren't political. They didn't know how to deal with the Marxists, who, he said, had taken over the organisation for purposes that clearly had nothing to do with the environment and were everything to do with destroying the economies of the West as fast as possible from within without a shot being fired. And I said to him, Eric, I said, look, you're about as political as a rabbit. And you're talking about Marxists having taken over your movement. Doesn't this all sound a bit kind of flaky and extreme? He said, look, that's what happened. The Berlin Wall came down, all these people piled out of it, piled into the Green movement, and they've taken it over and they're running it. He said, I call them watermelons. They're green on the outside and red on the in. My own phrase for these people who are at this Rio conference is the traffic light tendency. The green's too yellow to admit they're really reds. And this conference, from their point of view, has been a resounding failure. And from my point of view, as somebody who loves the West and would like to see it survive without being destroyed from within, it was a triumphant success. They had hoped to get the nations of the world to make binding commitments effectively to allow the United Nations to become a sort of world government. Now, you may think, listening to this, that that's rather extreme, talking about global government. Well, Al Gore's been talking about it, Jacques Chirac of France has been talking about it, Jacques Attali of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development has been talking about it. An awful lot of politicians have been talking about the desirability of, as they see it, global government. We know from the September the 15th, 2009 draft of what had been intended to be the Copenhagen Treaty, which fortunately failed when it was exposed to the public gaze, that they were indeed intending to put forward a 186-page blueprint for a global government with all its structures, all its revenue sources, the direct power of taxation given to the UN over the members of the UN, direct powers of environmental intervention, and the word government actually appears in this context twice in the draft of the treaty. You'll find it at Annex 1, sections 36 and 38. And they wanted to do the same here. They realized they could no longer bring forward the climate as an excuse, and you barely heard climate change mentioned here. Oh, it's still in the text. It's still there, but it's no longer the number one issue. In fact, right at the outset of the document that they have apparently agreed here, we weren't allowed into the conference even though we were accredited to it, because the UN has changed its policy. It doesn't want people like me getting in and talking to the delegates. We might persuade them that all this is unnecessary. But the beginning paragraph of this document said that the worst problem facing the world was not climate change, but poverty.
It's not as if global tyranny forcing us. It's not as if there is some sinister global tyranny forcing us. It's not as if there is some sinister global tyranny forcing us.
It used to be said, and perhaps it's still said, that if the Communist Party of Great Britain had had the geographical network and the resources that the Christian Church, and particularly the Church of England, has in these islands, we would have been a Stalinist dictatorship many years ago.
It's also true for Christians, as for other religious groups, that what we might call unofficial forms of solidarity across nations and cultures are routine. Christian congregations are frequently linked internationally. To give just a few examples from the UK, dioceses of the Church of England have partnerships with dioceses overseas. The Mothers' Union offers an impressive range of contacts for lay people and has obviously a particularly strong focus on women's issues in health and education. Church schools sometimes develop internet links with schools in Africa or India or the Middle East. These represent a range of ways to engage with development, not least in raising consciousness about development issues. They are to do with prayer and mutual learning as much as practical assistance, and they often involve people from the less privileged end of the partnership visiting and ministering in the UK. Of course, as with all development links, there is the ongoing risk of the patron-client problem, and there is a constant need for scrutiny to prevent these relationships slipping back into a classically unilateral and unbalanced style.
Good evening, Rowan. It's the 11th of March 2016 and it's about 11 PM and I'm making you my usual Friday evening video to reassure you I won't be seducing any priests over the weekend. Anyway, I thought we could carry on our little chat about your lecture, New Perspectives on Faith and Development, which is very illuminating, shall we say. Anyway, I've played a little clip of some things that you've said already. I'm not going to comment on that. It was just that the rest of what I'm going to say wouldn't have made much sense without that bit at the beginning. So, you go on to say, many faith organisations, like secular agencies, seek to be highly conscious about the dynamics of power and the nature of authentic partnership, and to build mutual accountability and transformation into their vision and practice. That sounds very impressive. I'm not sure what it means actually, building mutual accountability and transformation. Are you talking about the same thing again here, that the rich and the poor are both going to be transformed and liberated by having a dictatorial one world government telling everybody what to do with their property? Is that what you mean? Mutual accountability and transformation. Anyway, you go on to say, it's interesting to see, incidentally, how many of the same possibilities and challenges are increasingly being identified by Muslim-based development agencies, which have moved forward remarkably in the last decade or so. Now, I'd just like to point out that you're giving this lecture in 2010. So what happened in the last decade or so before 2010 then? Oh yeah, it was 9/11, wasn't it? When you were telling us that some Muslim terrorists blew up the Twin Towers. Oh, and you were also, weren't you, in 2005, handily positioned outside a mosque in West Yorkshire with a TV crew who just happened to turn up, so that you could be making comments on this as the Archbishop of Canterbury and programming people already to be associating this event with Muslims in West Yorkshire. It's another one of those amazing coincidences that happens so often in your life, and that's what I'm going to be arresting you for. Terrorism. Anyway, let's have a look at this again, see if I've missed anything out. It's interesting to see, incidentally, how many of the same possibilities and challenges are increasingly being identified by Muslim-based development agencies, which have moved forward remarkably in the last decade or so. So what you're saying is, they were very backward, but now luckily they're moving forward. They were stuck in the dark ages, but now they're becoming enlightened, just like me. That's what you're saying, isn't it? Anyway, you go on to say, like the churches, they can take for granted a powerful emotional solidarity and, though for different reasons and in different ways, a set of close cross-national relationships between particular communities. I think you mean there that a lot of Muslims in the West are immigrants from other parts of the world, and they often maintain links with their ancestral countries. A lot of Muslims in West Yorkshire, their ancestors or they themselves are from Pakistan, and when there was an earthquake there, they put a lot of effort into raising money and resources to help the people in the earthquake. I think that's what you mean. As in the Christian context, Islamic activists and organisers face the challenge of working out a distinctive approach to development questions without becoming exclusivist in their targets, and they recognise the need to locate development within the context of a global vision for the restoration of integral humanity. This is truly hilarious. It's another one of your poetic impressionistic statements, isn't it? Why, anyway, would Muslim development agencies or any development agency need to be looking at development within the context of a global vision anyway? Why would anyone need to be looking at anything within the context of a global vision? Because the globe's quite a big place, really, and we're quite small people, really, in comparison. Relatively speaking, we're very small and the globe's very large, and even as a nation, Britain is very small and the globe is very large. So why do we need to be looking at a global vision at all? I don't think that we do, really. I think you're programming us with more of the globalist agenda. And what is the problem with being exclusivist in your targets anyway? I mean, if people raise money, you have to be exclusivist because you're excluding somebody, aren't you? If you're giving to one group of people, however that bunch of people is defined as a group, then you're obviously missing out giving it to someone else. It's just a question of how you're going to be exclusivist. You can't avoid being exclusivist. And if people are giving help to people in their ancestral homelands, then probably those people are going to be the same culture and religion as them. So that is exclusivist. I just don't know why you're presenting that as if it's a bad thing. It hasn't got anything to do with you, what other people do with their money and property. It's got nothing to do with you. If people don't want to give money to a certain part of the world, then they just don't have to give it, do they? If they don't want their money to go there, they want it to go somewhere else. Or they want it to go where it's going to be more widely distributed, then they can donate it somewhere else, can't they? But that's what you want to avoid, isn't it? You want to break down the individual identity of individual people and communities, tribes, religions, regions, nations, anything that may contribute to defining a person as unique, you want to break down. That's your intention. I really like this bit that these Muslim development agencies, so you say, they recognise the need to locate development within the context of a global vision for the restoration of integral humanity. What on earth is integral humanity? And another thing, the restoration of integral humanity, when was integral? When was humanity integral before that it's going to be restored to that state? This is just complete nonsense. It's another one of your poetic, impressionistic outbursts. The restoration of integral humanity. It's hilarious. A vision or mission within which the element of economic liberation is vital but not the only priority. I don't even know what economic liberation means, to be honest. Does it mean that you've got more money than you had before? Is that economic liberation? You've got more than you had before, but is that economic liberation? This is just such a lot of flannel, it's unbelievable. It's globalist propaganda pumped out with a kind of padding of total flannel, poetic, impressionistic flannel, noise pollution. Anyway, I shall leave that there for now, and I'm going to make another comment a bit later on.
Many faith organisations, like secular agencies, seek to be highly conscious about the dynamics of power and the nature of authentic partnership, and to build mutual accountability and transformation into their vision and practice. But it's not simple, and as it has sometimes been expressed, the links described above illustrate how development is sometimes best understood when it is not the sole focus of a relationship or an agenda. It's interesting, incidentally, to see how many of the same possibilities and challenges are increasingly being identified by Muslim-based development agencies, which have moved forward remarkably in the last decade or so.
You will all become one with the Borg.
Like the churches, they can take for granted a powerful emotional solidarity and, though for different reasons and in different ways, a set of close cross-national relationships between particular communities. As in the Christian context, Islamic activists and organizers face the challenge of working out a distinctive approach to development questions without becoming exclusivist in their targets, and recognize the need to locate development within the context of a global vision for the restoration of integral humanity, a vision or mission within which the element of economic liberation is vital but not the only priority.
So you go on to say, I've used the term economic liberation, and I just want to comment here that you make a gesture with your glasses to indicate to me that there's going to be no economic liberation. And this was back in 2010, so it's 6 years later now. I wouldn't have even understood that at the time. I wouldn't have noticed it. So you wasted your time, really. So I seem to have lasted 6 years without any economic liberation, and I think I'll just go on surviving. I grew up in an environment without economic liberation, whatever that's supposed to mean. And in fact I've got more now than I had then, so I shall probably manage alright, thank you. So I don't need you to come and economically liberate me any more than I needed you to liberate me from capitalism, patriarchy and heteronormativity. Please don't liberate me. And if that was intended to manipulate me into giving you what you wanted, bad luck. Anyway, let's look at the whole statement. I've used the term economic liberation as a way of entering a mild caution about speaking too uncritically about development as a self-defining notion. Well, this is very interesting because I thought development was something like building infrastructure and advanced agricultural methods, improving access to healthcare and education, and providing clean water, that kind of thing. But it seems to me, from what you're saying, that it's about promoting an ideology to people in the developing world, which isn't even a Western ideology, as I've said before, because we've been suffering from cultural terrorism for over 100 years. So it's not even a Western ideology, it's a globalist ideology that's being imposed on everybody. And development, as you speak about it, doesn't seem to be about helping anybody. It just seems to be about indoctrinating them with the values that you want them to have. So development really is a self-defining notion, because until you started redefining it, everybody knew what development meant. And you go on to say, the word has notoriously been associated with one sort of global narrative allied to the hope of unrestricted economic growth. Well, on the subject of unrestricted economic growth, which you complain about an awful lot when you talk about the world economy and financial crises and that kind of thing, well, the only reason there was able to be this unrestricted economic growth anyway, where nations and individuals and businesses and so on got themselves into a lot of debt, was because of this constant inflating of bubbles, like the housing bubble and so on, which is made possible by fractional reserve banking, which is something you never mentioned, although you did make a slip up in a lecture you gave at St Paul's Cathedral some time ago, where you said something about economics was not just about generating a series of zeros on a spreadsheet, so you nearly gave the game away by saying it's not what it actually is, because it is just about generating numbers on a spreadsheet, really. This is what the banksters do, and then they lend us money they've made out of nothing and expect us to pay them back on interest. And the money for the interest has never been created, so it's a perpetual situation of debt. It's impossible to pay this debt back within the current system that's been created by these criminal banksters who are trying to take over the whole world. So even though you repeatedly criticise unrestricted economic growth and the hope of unrestricted economic growth, for some reason, despite the fact that you're an absolute genius and you know everything, allegedly, according to all the propaganda about you, you would have thought God would have told you this as well, since you're so holy and close to God, that the banksters are behind all of this, and without fractional reserve banking it wouldn't be possible. So maybe I've educated you about something there. So in addition to, in your next sermon, preaching that the Rothschilds can redistribute all their wealth everywhere, this is after you've redistributed your wealth, by the way. You can then tell the Rothschilds to redistribute their wealth, and then you can tell everybody about fractional reserve banking and what a con it is, can't you? And then all these financial crises will become history. So there you are. The problem that you claim to be so concerned about is very easily solved, but despite the fact you're a genius and very holy, You didn't figure it out yourself, and God didn't tell you either. I just can't understand it. Anyway, moving on. And given the mixture of factors in our contemporary world that suggest this is a dangerously naive hope, we ought to be qualifying our language about development so as to free it from any such automatic alliance. This is the understanding of unrestricted growth, isn't it? Unrestricted economic growth. I propose that one of the contributions of religious conviction to the discussion of these issues is that faith, by putting economic development in a wider context, allows us to raise the perennially difficult and often evaded question of what the purpose of material growth is. Well, the purpose of material growth, if you mean people, societies and people developing and becoming more wealthy, relatively speaking, then it's to make human life easier and more survivable, and to improve access to education and the basic necessities of life and that kind of thing. That's the purpose of material growth. Now, I know you're anti-human and you want to get rid of us all because you're a Luciferian and a psychopath, but that's the purpose of material growth, so we don't need to be having any debates about it, because everybody who's got half a brain understands what the purpose of material growth is. In other words, to check the idea that unlimited material expansion, as opposed to freedom from poverty, is a self-evident good for any economy or for the world as a whole. Well, as I've said, if you addressed fractional reserve banking, this would remove this problem. You're just obfuscating here, because you know perfectly well what the problem is, because you're working for the banksters. If we talk about economic liberation, that's to bring us back to the aim of making persons and cultures agents on their own behalf, able to exercise some creative freedom in regard to their conditions of living, and that is a different matter from simply guaranteeing material growth at a certain level, because it factors in the criteria of how human dignity is to be served. So you're talking about liberating here, but it sounds more like dictating to me. Why are the people that you're talking about here? You talk about making persons and cultures agents on their own behalf. Well, why are they not already agents on their own behalf? They are agents on their own behalf. They don't need you to go and tell them how to be agents on their own behalf. How have they been surviving up until now if they're not agents on their own behalf? It seems to me it's more about you going in there and dictating another set of values and telling them how to be agents on their own behalf when they know it perfectly well already, and you want to take that away from them. And then you talk about exercising some creative freedom in regard to their conditions of living. This is more noise pollution, exercising some creative freedom in regard to their own conditions of living. That's another impressionistic, poetic heap of garbage. And that is a different matter from simply guaranteeing material growth at a certain level, because it factors in the criteria of how human dignity is to be served. Well, that's another outburst of noise pollution, isn't it? And who's going to be serving human dignity? You talk about serving, but when you say serving, this word is completely redefined, because servants don't go about telling people how they're going to serve them. You know, the person who employs the servant says what they want doing. They're the one with the agency. They make a contract with the servant that the servant will do this kind of work for this amount of money or whatever. But when you talk about serving, what you mean is dictating. You call it serving, but it isn't serving. If you were serving, you'd be listening, not talking. And especially not talking this amount of flannel. It's completely ridiculous. Anyway, I shall leave it there, but I shall be making my usual Sunday evening video, obviously, to reassure you I haven't been seducing any priests over the weekend. But I have got my eye on your activities still, and you'll be back in my old stomping ground on Monday, won't you, in Bristol? So, be alert. Hasta la próxima.
I've used the term economic liberation as a way of entering a mild caution about speaking too uncritically of development as a self-defining notion. The word has notoriously been associated with one particular sort of global narrative, allied to the hope of unrestricted economic growth. And given the mixture of factors in our contemporary world that suggest this is a dangerously naive hope, we ought to be qualifying our language about development so as to free it from any such automatic alliance. I've proposed that one of the contributions of religious conviction to the discussion of these issues is that faith, by putting economic development in a wider context, allows us to raise the perennially difficult and often evaded question of what the purpose of material growth is. In other words, to check the idea that unlimited material expansion, as opposed to freedom from poverty, is a self-evident good for any economy or for the world as a whole. If we talk about economic liberation, that's to bring us back to the aim of making persons and cultures agents on their own behalf, able to exercise some creative freedom in regard to their conditions of living. And that is a different matter from simply guaranteeing material growth at a certain level, because it factors in the criterion of how human dignity is to be served.
Worf, Klingon species, a warrior race. You two will be assimilated.
The Klingon Empire will never yield.
Why do you resist? We only wish to raise quality of life for all species.
I like my species the way it is.
A narrow vision. You will become one with the Borg. You will all become one with the Borg.